consultants and admins. I see Jim and Doris. If that's what you're looking for. But we're live streaming and recording, so it'll be available to people that want to check in. All right, so that was a little bit of a delay. Let me get started. I'm Steve Parker-Zielinski, the superintendent. So we're here tonight just to talk a little bit about this capital project that's going to go to voters on December 13th. That's Tuesday from 1 to 8 p.m. So the goal from the district side is to make sure that people are aware that the vote is happening, that they understand the project that's being proposed, and they get all the questions answered so that they can make an informed vote. It is always our desire to get the most people out to vote. We want to hear from the community. We feel more confidence in the vote if there's a lot of voters. And so, a lot of our efforts are to just make people aware and encourage people not to skip it, to come on out and vote. So I thought that I'd start tonight just answering the question about the timing of the project, the planning of the project, and why it's happening now, and how it gets financed. Because these are questions that are often a little bit confusing to people. They see the price tag on the project is $21.9 million, and they wonder, how does the district pay for a $21.9 million project? And yet they still say it's not going to have any additional impact on our taxes. And so that's the part that I want to address first. So it's important to know that in our school budget, which is currently around $26 million, there's a piece of our budget that's devoted to capital work debt service. So every time that we do a big project like this, it gets initially funded by borrowing. So we borrow the money, and then we have, just like any loan, we pay back the loan over the course of many, many years. This $400,000, we refer to it as the local share of this debt service, and it's a very stable part of our budget. I'm going to mention it a lot, the $400,000. This is the part to pay the most attention to. This is very deliberate on the part of the board and on the part of the district. And the goal is to keep that number stable over time. And so even as we do new projects, if that number stays stable, remember that your taxes fund the general fund budget. So if this number is always around the $400,000, then you don't see any impact in your taxes related to a capital project. That's the takeaway from the first few slides here. This number has been stable for about the last decade. Our goal is to keep it stable. Whenever we do planning ahead of time for projects, we look at that number and we see when there's fluctuations in it, and then we make a move so that it stays stable. And I'll show you how that informs us about when the next big capital project needs to come along. There's a system in New York State that funds capital work for public entities. There's a set aside in the state budget for this purpose. So every school district has a unique aid ratio. Ours is 81.5%. And so that in the end, the state pays for 81.5% of the project by providing state aid over time to offset our principal and interest payments on the loan. That's the way that that works. Here's a few more details. So this is the familiar chart that we always look at to track this local share. And what you're seeing up here on this one is that in the school year ending in 2023 and 24, there's the $400,000. It's right where we want it to be. There's a fall off that's happening in the 24-25 year and continues on here. And so when this number falls off, it's because some of these older bonds have been paid off, so the debt service falls off. This is our opportunity now to fill that in so that we can keep that $400,000 stable and do new work. And it's the system that allows school districts and other public entities to do regular capital work that's necessary and desired without this major impact on the taxpayers. So that's what we've been looking at for several years now in advance to plan the project to happen at this time. So if the project moves forward, if it's approved by the voters, then looking out into the future, we'll have this $400,000 number set there all the way up through the school year 2031-32. So you can see that by doing this work now at this price, and borrowing the way that we're going to borrow, we can set that $400,000 stable all the way up through 31-32, and that's the goal. That's why we're doing it now. I put this chart up here not because we're going to pay too much attention to it. It's too difficult to see all the lines here. But if you can make out this part here, this is where that $400,000 is. And the important thing to know about the borrowing for this project is there's a period of time from 2025-26 where we do the borrowing. We're going to be investing capital reserve money for the project. And we set up this amortization schedule, the debt service schedule, so that it settles right in to this situation, this very, very stable situation, where what we've got is state aid for about $1.2 million annually coming in to offset that principal and interest payment. And then the principal and interest on this particular bond would be about $1.52 million. If you're doing the math in your head, the difference there is not exactly 400,000, it's a little bit under that, so it'll be about 300,000 and change. The local share will be about 400,000 because we've got other existing bonds there. So this is the impact from this project, and then there's the total net local share, and that's the number that we care about, and so you can see that $400,000 number carry through. Does anybody have questions about this, about the way that this works? I will say this a few times tonight. If you think of questions between now and the day of the vote, please ask. Reach out and ask and get your questions answered. That's the most important thing, is that you get your questions answered. So the way that we can control that number, that $400,000 number, is a few different ways. One is that we know it's coming well in advance. So we've been engaged at the Board of Education level and the Buildings and Grounds Committee for a few years now, anticipating a December 2022 vote on the next big capital project. We work with our financial planners to help us understand the scale of the project that's available for us, and we can arrange the borrowing to keep that $400,000 number stable. So for a long time, we were working with an estimate of about $20 million. As we've gotten closer and closer, it's come into more focus. So we're settled now at $21.9 million. And even after this borrowing happens, and as we move forward, we're already thinking into the future about the next time that number comes down. And that, we'll be thinking about when we're going to be planning the next big project. So it happens on a regular cycle. If you have the newsletter, if you haven't gotten the shopper yet, or if you don't have it with you, we have copies here. We do describe in there this whole idea of trying to keep the number stable, and that's the reason why we can always say there's no additional tax impact on doing a project like this. When we're thinking about the capital work, we've got 2 campuses, 2 buildings here. And so, I'll talk for a little bit about how we get the scope of the project, how we decide exactly what work to do when. But this is the process that we use, and it's a long-range process. By doing this and creating this stability, we don't subject ourselves to the volatility in that number, where there actually will be an impact up or down on taxes every time we have to do new capital work. So this last point down here at the bottom, if we don't do it this way, then what ends up happening is, as we have necessary capital work that can be pricey, we always would have to say, well, now we're going to need to borrow. That's going to impact that local share number, and for the next few years it's going to go up. So from a community standpoint, it's much more advantageous and much more responsible on the part of the board to keep that number stable over time. And we know that we're going to have regular opportunities to do important work and use the system that's available to us in New York State to make sure that the work gets done. One last point about this, sometimes again it's confusing. People will say, but even that money coming from New York State to pay 81.5% of that project, that's coming from us too, right? It's coming from our taxes and from the other ways that the state gets revenue. And yes, that's true. So this is public money, and so it's publicly funded. The only point to make there is that Albany already has this money. It's already built into the state budget. They will use this money for capital work at public entities around the state. We want to make sure that our portion of it comes to Seneca County, comes to South Seneca, instead of, if we pass up on it, they'll send it to Long Island, they'll send it to Buffalo, they'll send it to the North Country. So the state generates revenue in all the ways that they generate revenue, from income tax to sales tax to throughway tolls. So they have the money in the state budget designated for this purpose, and so we bring that money back home on this regular basis so that we can get this work done. From a bottom line perspective, in this particular project, the bonds that we'll take out are $18.79 million. We're going to invest $3.1 million from our capital reserve. This is another piece of our long-range planning, is that we build a capital reserve so that we can offset some of the costs when it's time to do that. That's what the capital reserve is for. Yes?
Does that capital reserve earn an interest?
It does, yes. So we invest all the money in standard bank accounts, but also short-term investment. And so when we're holding this amount of money, we're trying to maximize the interest on it. So yes.
Do you have an idea of what percentage rate it is?
Miguel?
Right now, Treasury bills, which we can invest, are around maybe 3%.
About 3%.
But this year, just this year. Now, remember, the capital reserve has been there for a few years. So interest rates have gone up recently, and yes, we're investing.
Yes. The total referendum, as I've been saying, is $21.89 million. So those are the numbers on this particular project. I'm going to turn our attention now to how we built the scope of this project, where the actual work that we're planning to do, where that came from. And so the first thing to know is that New York State requires school districts on a 5-year cycle to do what's called a building condition survey. And so we do an in-depth study of the condition of our buildings and our grounds and all of our facilities. And what it does is it generates a list, a menu, if you will, of all of the items that could potentially need work coming up into the future. It will point out items that are getting to the end of their expected useful life. It will also point out things that are already in disrepair. And it will point out things where we're become out of compliance with things like the American for Disabilities Act. So we might have to pay attention to safety issues. In addition to that, whenever we're talking about a big project, we also need to be thinking not only in terms of what we need, but what we want. So we heard from this community in the last go-around that they were anxious for us to finally have a track. So that's not something that shows up on the BCS, but it's something that shows up in the district wish list. And so sometimes you want to invest money in the wish list, and other times you want to invest money in the things that are falling out of disrepair. So these projects are typically a blend of these things. Sometimes they're splashier than others. Sometimes they're very utilitarian, where we just have to fix that roof, or we just have to address these safety issues. One thing that always has to be understood is that safety and compliance comes first. So when we understand that we're out of compliance with something, we have to remedy that. And when we understand that we have an unsafe situation in the district, we have to remedy that. So that always comes to the top of the list. Beyond that, we look at all of the items and we engage the Board of Education typically. Sometimes we make community committees if there's some question about what needs to happen. But this time around, we had 3 really high priority items that are the headliners of this particular project, things that really needed to happen. And so this district has been talking about building a new transportation facility for 15 or 20 years. The existing bus garage, that we call it, is a series of bays and a couple of offices and a receiving area. And it's something that is very, very old. It's been in its footprint there since the 1950s. And it has evolved in use over time, but it's gotten to the point now where we have to pour a lot of money into repairs. There's a lot of water damage that happens on a regular basis in that facility. We did a video last summer, at the end of last summer, to kind of do a virtual tour of that. That's still on the website for people that are interested in looking at it. And it sort of goes through bay by bay and shows the issues that we've been having. Yes, Tom?
Just to be clear, for the new transportation facility, is it only for the Ovid campus or also includes the Interlaken campus?
So it's a district transportation facility that will sit in Ovid.
Okay.
So it serves the whole district.
Okay.
Yes. It will actually change function a little bit. It's going to be more dedicated to simply transportation in a different way than the existing facility is sort of a hodgepodge of different things. I'm going to mention in a minute that we plan to move that receiving area out of that facility. This one will be dedicated strictly to transportation. It'll be a modern facility. It will upgrade us in ways that will accommodate the newer buses. A different problem that we've had with this particular facility is that the bays are actually a little short for the newest buses, and it's a challenge to get them in and out. We have a wash bay in the existing bus garage, but there's no possibility of moving a bus into one side and out the other. So it has to go about halfway in and then wash half the bus, and then you turn it around and bring it in again. So all of these things will be remedied in the new facility. Plus, we'll upgrade our storage. We'll upgrade the repair bays, the wash bay. The offices will be a little bit modernized. It'll be a nice, brand new facility that we can be proud of for many, many years. Go ahead.
All right.
No worries. That's what we're here for.
So the new transportation facility, obviously it's going to be the new bus garage.
Yep.
And offices. Will part of the building also be utilized by buildings and grounds? So like the fellas that mow the lawn with the tractors and so on and so forth, are they going to be able to share that facility for maintenance and cleaning?
It's an excellent question. The answer is yes, but it's a little bit of a problem. And let me tell you why. Because when we build a transportation facility, in these projects, we're always thinking about what's aidable and what's not aidable. So when I talk about that 81.5% aid on the project, the state has rules about that. You can do certain things, you can't do other things. One thing is that if we build space that is entirely dedicated simply to storing the landscaping equipment or the mowers or the plows, that is not considered to be aidable. It's not considered to be a transportation facility. So as we design this facility, we have to be clever about doing dual uses, and we have to talk specifically about what it is that we're going to be using it for. But we do anticipate still being able to store that equipment in this facility. But that's the issue with that one.
Understood.
Yep, perfect. The other big thing that has been a conversation piece in this district for a while now is flood mitigation in this building. As it so happens, just today, we had to close school in this building because we had a water main break in Interlaken. It's something that they've been struggling with for a while. But in terms of the school, we've been struggling with heavy rainstorms in this building. It's different than it used to be. Everybody knows that we had a major flood event that was mostly Lodi and Sheldrake a few years ago, a few summers ago, but it did a number on this building because the water washed in from where the playground is into the primary wing, down into the parking lot. I see Doris sitting here. She had to spend weeks and weeks and weeks. I can picture all of the soggy papers laying on the ground as we dried them out because the water just poured down into our record storage. And so that was a traumatic event for a lot of us in this community, but particularly in this school. And then a couple of years ago, we had another one where it was another heavy rain that caused more flooding in this building again. And so we're in a situation now where every time there's a torrential downpour, we worry about this. So we've been trying to address it in the short term and in the long term. In the short term, we've been doing small things to try and mitigate the water coming in, especially in that primary wing. We're investing what's called our capital outlay project this year to install some barriers in that primary wing to prevent the water from coming into the univents, the heating and cooling units in those rooms, which is a big problem for us. But we always knew that if we were going to fix it for real, we'd have to really invest a lot of money and put it into a capital project. So this is the project. I'll talk about it a little bit more in detail in a minute, but that's the other big one for this project. Of course, at the same time, especially starting last spring, this community has been involved in conversation, just like a lot of communities around the country, about the threat of school violence, about safety and security in the building. And so we're always in a process of thinking about that. And now we're committing to, especially the two entryways, the one in this building and the one over in the middle high school, to making those more secure entryways. We've already done some work in that regard. This project will also continue that work and transform those entryways even more to be even more secure. And so that's a third biggie in this project. Other than that, it's not the only thing. We cost those things out. We estimate the costs. We see if there might be a possibility of addressing some of those BCS, building condition survey items, in a big project like this. So some of the other things that are going to happen, I mentioned a minute ago that we're going to relocate the receiving area in Ovid. We're going to move it away from the bus garage and to we have a spot planned. I'll show you on the map in a minute in Ovid about where we can do that. We have been talking about expanding the sidewalk access at this facility. And so there's been a lot of community input, staff input, people talking about how much better it would be if we had more sidewalks and repaired sidewalks at this facility. So that's going to happen in this project. And then as we go through the BCS and we look at the compliance items and the safety items, some of the other things that will happen in this is addressing some windows, addressing some flooring, especially over in the middle high school. And we're going to look to do some repairs on the historic front entrance of the middle high school where the portico is and the columns. So it's not just the columns that we're going to pay attention to. There's also some work that needs to be done in just surrounding that ramp that's there. All of that will get addressed in this project. If you have the newsletter, or you can get it on the website as well. We've included these diagrams, these maps about what's happening in the project in terms of the scope. So let me just walk through this. What we're looking at here is the Ovid campus. This is where the bus garage, the new transportation facility, will be. The existing site is right here, if you can picture it. So, the building faces Main Street in that direction. Behind the building is the existing facility. That's going to be torn down, and this new one is going to replace it. So that's the big headline item in this. Hunt has created for us a rendering of, so you can kind of picture it a little bit, where it would be in that space. And so This is the general idea of what it will look like when it's finished. So there's some pretend buses that are parked there. And we're going to use this, existing parking lot space to build this new facility here. So as you come up the driveway, you'll see it there. So I really want people to be ready for the, what it's going to look like there.
What size building is proposed and how many bays ideally is it gonna be?
So we got 2 repair bays and a wash bay. And then we also have to accommodate a lot of the storage things. So it'll be 3 main bays, plus a little. And then it's gonna have 2 stories to it. So it's gonna have plenty of storage, the kind of storage that we need. We have to store liquids, we have to store parts, tires, and so all of that will be in that facility. If you can see down, like the lower part of it will be, like what an office might look like with maybe some bricks. And then the rest of the construction is different up above.
Will the new facility have the capability to have, say, solar panels on the roof to help it be a little bit more energy independent?
Potentially, yes. That's not part of what we're designing at this moment, but the potential is there in the future, yes.
How will storage be utilized on this, if that's a second story? I mean, are we lugging tires manually?
So part of the design of these things is, maybe Josh, you can talk about this, is there's there are lifts that are on a system that goes across the whole thing. But in terms of getting parts upstairs, some of it'll be carried, but some of it'll be hoisted with lifts. Josh, can you say more about that?
Yeah, so basically the front half of what you're seeing here is the office space. So that'll have the second floor storage, mechanical room, and like what Steve said, there's a hoist beam that other facilities use. So basically it's a platform that you can raise up using the mechanical hoist, and then there's a removable railing so they can slide it in, and then later stuff they could carry if they wanted to.
Yeah, because if it's not handy, they're not gonna lug.
Right.
Second question,
Yep.
I'm looking at the driveway here and I see that will be the access for the new receiving
Yep.
area. How is the driveway gonna be? Because you're looking at tractor trailers receiving and going up that sidewalk there.
Yeah,
They need to make that turn. That
it's a
driveway
great
does not
question.
look like it's really that much.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the idea of the receiving area, it's going to be right there. So if you can picture, for those of us that are really familiar with our building, you can picture the art and tech wing here. And so as we approach in the driveway, this will be the access to that receiving area. And so we have been thinking about this very thing. So when we have delivery trucks now, they come all the way through to the main entrance here, and they do they deliver food supplies and these kinds of things here, or they come out to where the bus garage is and deliver packages there. So that's the existing. But we don't like that situation where they're at the main entrance there. So this is part of the idea, is to get move the trucks into this section here. But Doris, you're exactly right. It's a big tractor trailer. With the way that this is drawn here, they'd have to pull here and then back in that way to do that receiving. So one of the things that we've been talking about in the design phase that we're going to play around with is creating an access that might approach this way and then turn. So it could be that we build a drive that would go here and then around. They can turn here this way and then back up. It'll get them out of the driveway, away from the cars that are coming in and out there, and it would solve that. It's just a question of taking up the real estate and the aesthetics of building it that way.
So with the new layout, with where the proposed bus garage is gonna be and bus parking and the new entryway for receiving and things like that.
Yeah.
We know that we have a neighbor right next to the driveway. how much of this is going to affect our relationship with the neighbor? Because I know even when I was in school, the neighbors really didn't like it when we were walking through their yard, when we were, is it gonna have an effect on our relationship with our neighbors?
It's a good question. I will say that that neighbor has been a neighbor of our school building for a very long time.
Right.
And so they're used to the bustle of the school day. We don't anticipate really that it will be that much different. So one of the things that goes into the design of a bus garage, for example, is the ability to bring a bus either through the bays and out the other side. You can see this rendering of a bus making the turn there. Or just coming around and doing a U-turn and heading into these parking things here. So when a bus backs up, it has the beep, beep, beep. And so I am aware that in other districts, when they build bus garages near neighbors and they don't think about that, you end up having buses going into reverse in the early morning hours and creating that beep, beep, beep. We won't have that with this design here. So I don't think, we already have, as we said, the existing bus garage is here, we park buses here. I don't think from the perspective of the neighbor it's going to be really that much different. We don't think it will. Brenda.
So with the possibility of 50 more parking areas on the east side,
Yep.
will there, I mean, be considered another walkover? Because there's almost like we need actually 2 lanes to come in and we don't have it. I know there's a bottleneck in the morning coming up through, and now you're parking up on the east side, you have to walk across. So, I mean, the yellow thing you put down below, the walk that we have right now,
Yep.
where the students park,
Yep.
it's gonna be almost nil.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So have you considered where or how we're gonna do something?
So, we make a lot of use of this sidewalk here, and, this is the area where bus pickup and drop off happens in the morning. And so, the thought is that, we'll create some kind of crosswalk here, so that people that are using this parking lot, what they're gonna do is if they're parking over on this side, they're gonna probably wanna enter the building there. If they're parking over on this side, they're gonna wanna use the main entrance. And so, there again, you're right, the pedestrian flow will be different. There won't be a lot of pedestrians coming from here the way there are now. But, I think that we've got a design here that accommodates the people coming off of that parking lot. Jim?
Well, we have problems now with people going through reds while we're unloading and loading.
Yeah.
How are we solving that? Because that looks like a bigger problem right now.
Isn't that a people problem? I mean, the answer to that is awareness, education, a little bit of discipline. So, it's really just, I don't know that a capital project solves that issue. That's more of a people being respectful of what the rules are around a bus that's got the red flashers.
Yep, teachers want to get to work at the same time.
You think
It
if
doesn't
it's
work.
22.1 million, we can fix it?
I'm just saying.
Yeah, I don't know that a project really addresses that so much. We can think about things like traffic flow for sure. And so, as we redesign this parking lot, those things are part of the design. But there's not going to be a real dramatic difference. No. Go ahead, Brenda.
The asbestos removal would, I take it those are the parking floors that we have?
Yeah.
What's left? Are they all earmarked as to what's going to be changed?
Yes.
How many rooms are there? 2, 3,
Do
4,
you remember, Josh?
5?
How many rooms?
Don't know off the top of my head. I think it's like 6.
That sounds about right. About half a dozen rooms.
Some on the first floor, some on the second floor?
Yes.
Okay, I
There's one
can
here.
see where one is. It's a room that's so antiquated science room. Is there anything but just a new floor to be put in there? There's nothing built in to make this a safer science room with maybe more than 2 small sinks that work and gas lines that are shut off, but a narrow tunnel where kids, when they stand on the side of a lab table, they have exchanges on the window if they're standing there, and they had to have a fire drill.
Yeah.
There's no, it's very, very unsafe in that room.
So when we think about those questions, they all appear on our BCS. It's part of the consideration of all of the pieces of the project. We did talk about upgrades to the science rooms because we are aware of those issues. Sometimes the conversation is, can we get that work done in-house without a big project? If so, that sometimes is our preference to do it within the existing budget as it is. If the answer is no, then we think about including it in the scope of this project. And sometimes what happens when we create the final scope of the project is we create what are called alternates, which says that, you know, as we play out the project and we're spending the money and it turns out that we have, you know, the availability to do a little bit more work, we name those ahead of time and we say, in an alternate, we might be able to address this or that.
I'm asking if the board, when it comes to that, has the opportunity to say, make it an alternate. In other words, instead of doing these two rooms, we nix those to put some of that, into maybe something like this. Is it something, we did it on one big capital project. Let's see, we're not gonna do a transportation department. You know, we nixed that. Is that something we can do later on?
The board can control that. We have to be careful about when we go out to a vote in December, the scope has to be set.
You're saying
So,
the scope, the money needs to be set.
but I will say that the way that the scope is written does give us a little bit of flexibility internally. If we say that we're going to address floors and rooms, then it doesn't, you know, we can pivot a little bit about what the exact work is that addresses the floors and the rooms. So yeah, there's always an opportunity for the board to tweak. Yes.
And it's 2 years away.
Yeah, and it's a timeline for sure.
With a project of this size, number one, how long of a period of time are we projecting it's going to take? But also, what kind of impact is it going to have to the everyday school life of teachers and students and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I've got a final few slides at the end that go through the timeline. It won't be fast. So even after the project passes with the referendum, there's a long process that goes through state ed. We also have to be aware of when the prime building seasons are for exactly the reason you're talking about. We always want to take advantage of summers. We always want to take advantage of vacation time. So a lot of the work gets planned for summers. And if we can't do it during the summer of 23, then we have to think about the summer of 24. And so, you know, I'll show you on the timeline the way that that's going to work. And we're always going to work to minimize the impact. We want to do it when the buildings are mostly empty. That's not entirely possible all the way, but when we do it, you know, we have staging areas. We try to do the work outside of the school day, those kinds of things. So I'll show you that timeline in a few slides.
And then another question that pops into my head is, with a project of this scale, are we going to be hiring contractors not from this area? Like, are they going to be coming from out of state? Or is there going to be opportunity for local, you know, school district companies or surrounding areas to participate in this type of project?
We do love it when we get local companies, local contractors to work on the project. What happens after the bid passes, or after the vote passes, is there's a bidding process on the project. So as a public entity, we have to do a request for bids from any contractor that wants to bid on the project. Typically, it's regional. So, you know, we're going to attract more local contractors to work in this project. It almost always does happen that way. But we are subject a little bit to the procedure of the bidding process about who we end up with. But, you know, almost always we try to even get a picture of the local contractors that are working on the project, because, you know, there's another way that we've brought business into the community by doing this kind of work.
One last thought.
Yeah.
With capital projects like this, new bus garage, so on and so forth, are we gonna be adding potential jobs to our school district, or subtracting, or staying the same?
I don't see a huge impact on staffing in this work. It was a different conversation when we were adding that track facility and the concession stand, because we knew that there was going to be maintenance out there that we didn't have before. But we already have an existing bus facility, so building a new one is just going to replace one with the other. Doing the work on the security and the secured entrances, that's not going to change staffing. Receiving isn't going to change staffing. The flood mitigation isn't really going to change staffing. So I don't think this particular scope of work is going to have a big staffing impact, one way or the other. It's probably a little bit neutral. All right, did I neglect anything in this building? I don't want to. So I mentioned the front main entrance will get some work. We're talking about the replacement of the flooring in some of the classrooms. We talked about the receiving area. This is the main entrance where that secured entrance is going to be built up. I will say that part of the phasing of this project means that if we're going to build here, we have to time it as such that we don't want to demolish too soon and be without a facility. So we're going to have to pay attention to the phasing of the project. And also during construction, there's going to be some impact in terms of people parking there. So we're going to lose parking spots during construction. We were talking at one of the board meetings recently that we can remember times when we had a whole bunch of rows of cars parked out on Main Street. So I predict that we're going to see that again for a short period of time while we transition from one building to the next.
Those are students.
Yeah, Peter.
The two highlighted areas that are near your office area, what's going on there?
So that's just a continuation of where we're looking at those wooden floors.
Okay.
Yeah.
One last one.
Yeah.
Change slides. So currently, we know that where the existing bus garage is, there's the fuel island
Yeah.
for fueling the buses and so on and so forth. Where is that gonna be relocated with?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's on here.
Yeah.
That's the bottom one.
Last one, yeah, relocation and modification of the existing fuel island. So the fuel island is back behind the existing bus garage.
Yep.
And it's going to move probably into this area here. So we're still talking about the perfect position of that. Lance, on behalf of the Transportation Department, had some opinions about it, about what would be exactly the right placement. But it's going to come over into this part, which is really going to be transformed now into just mostly transportation traffic. So the station's going to be over there. One last thing I forgot to mention is that there's a big conversation in the state about transitioning to electric buses. We're not at that stage yet where we're transitioning to electric buses, but we will make sure that when we build a new transportation facility, that it will have the infrastructure already in there so that when it comes time to put charging stations in, that we won't have to tear apart and rebuild. So we'll make sure that the infrastructure is there to point to the future when there'll eventually be electric buses in the fleet. All right, let me move over to Interlaken. In some ways, this is a simpler design. You see this big colored area here, which is the parking lot behind the school. And there's this little highlighted area here on the other side where the buses come in. And that's where most of the work is going to happen related to this flood mitigation. We commissioned a study from Hunt's engineers in February of 22 to just look at everything about our status quo situation. So they looked at the content of the soil, they looked at all of the drainage patterns, they looked at the creek behind the building, and we tried to do an extensive look to analyze the issue that we have, why we're subject to all of this flooding. And the study identified 3 points of interest where water tends to collect and then infiltrate in the building. So one of those is where it came rushing down into the records room. This is the area over by the primary wing. So just to orient everybody, this is to the south, this is to the north. Interlaken Main Street is up here. And so as you come back around in the back of the building, these areas here are the places where water tends to collect and then infiltrate the building. And so the big takeaway from the study is that if we're going to do a good job with this, we're going to need to redirect that drainage, which means that we're going to have to do extensive work in this parking lot. And then this situation out here is a historic situation. So the drainage pipes in that particular place that divert water out to Main Street, the configuration as it exists goes from larger pipes to smaller pipes, which is exactly the opposite of what you want for draining a lot of water all at once. So that's a backup, that's a point where it backs up because it overwhelms those pipes and then it backs up into the system, creates more flooding. So a piece of this work will be to tear all of that up and fix that part, and then a lot of the work here is going to be on redirecting that drainage to go around the perimeter of the building. As I mentioned, in the short term, we've also addressed some barriers here at the primary wing that'll just help in some of the smaller events and prevent that water from going into the univents. Yes?
So with this water mitigation, we know that we have a lot of blacktop, a lot of area, and when it rains heavily, it wants to go to the drain,
Yeah.
not the pipe. Now, is the village of Interlaken, the town of Culver, and or the state of New York, are they going to be able to make accommodations to keep up with the capital project that we want to do to get rainwater away?
So we have a really good relationship with Interlaken and Culver. We work with them all the time. We were just working with them today on this water main issue. So we have good back and forth communication with them. And so as we do our designs, they're aware of what's happening. And so then, we can only do work on property that we own. Actually, this conversation has really gotten us involved in our neighbors and some of the issues with where the water is coming from related to the neighbors. We also want to be careful when we do our work, we don't make it worse for the neighbors. So I think that's maybe where your question is coming from.
Yes.
And so the way that we prevent that is by just having good communication so they know exactly what we're doing. And so they understand that we have this issue. They're very supportive of us addressing it, and they know it's going to take a lot of work to redirect it. But if we're doing this well, then it'll drain in the way it was intended to drain, and hit the drainage on Main Street. So we just have to keep talking with them and working with them. Peter?
Steve, we also talked about working with Jack Pursoon right on that whole drainage ditch, right?
Yeah.
Cleaning that out. So
Yeah.
I think I don't know if it's complete, but we had to get soil and water involved in that process. But that was also one of those more immediate things that we were working on.
Exactly. So that conversation is ongoing. Soil and water doesn't act too fast. We're trying to speed them up, but we've got great cooperation with Mr. Pursoon, and he's got the equipment to help us out with it. We just want to make sure that we got the necessary permission and permits to dredge there. But yeah, we continue to have that, to be thinking about that as well. We shied away a little bit from doing a lot of work back there because of this neighbor issue. So, when we were talking about potentially building berms, to divert the water there, neighbors started getting a little bit nervous that we were going to be directing the water to them. And so we kind of backed off on that idea a little bit, and we think that by addressing the overall drainage around the perimeter, we'll be much better off and we'll avoid these big flood events.
I know it's highlighted where the water issues are and where it infiltrates the building.
Yeah,
Behind the school, and I remember this being a little kid, behind the school where the ball fields are, the playground, all that sort of thing, common sense tells you that's a higher elevation, the school's at a lower elevation.
yeah,
Water runs downhill.
yeah.
So is there, in combination with fixing drains in parking lots and so on and so forth, is there a way to help direct water away from the school before it gets to the school in the sense of like a French drain where it directs water around the school instead of letting the water come to the school?
It's one of the reasons we commissioned this study, because we wanted to explore all possible options. And so we talked about those things. And the ultimate conclusion is that the main problem that we have is just the way that the water drains into the building and where it collects. So we're pretty confident now, having done all of that studying, that if we do this work, we're going to fix our problem. So yeah, those fields are still going to get flooded. You're absolutely right, they're a little bit higher than the building, so the water's going to come down there. But this plan will create drainage patterns such that it won't give us that same problem that we had before.
Gotcha.
There is some miscellaneous work, in addition to, I should mention, the work on the secure entrance. I mentioned some window work. Some of that's going to be around the library in this building. We've noticed some deterioration around the perimeter there that we'll address in this project. But that's just, some minor stuff. You can see the list up here in the newsletter and what's posted online about some of the little miscellaneous stuff going on in Interlaken. Let me get to this timeline because you wanted another question?
Yep.
Yep.
I know that we keep speaking about upgrading security and making improvements to the entryways and things like that. Can you speak on what some of those prospective upgrades would be? Is it locks and doors? Is it?
Sure. So, one of the issues with entryways is that staff have a particular kind of access to the buildings that visitors don't have, so like a key card. In the situation as it exists today, any staff member that accesses that entrance using their key card will unlock that door, the door opens up, they go in, and there's the potential for somebody who's standing there to just go right in there with them.
Slip in.
And so that's considered to be not as secure as if we had the visitor entrance be separate from the staff entrance. So one of the thoughts to design in these new secure things is to create two different paths. One place for staff to go with their key card entry, and another place for a visitor to get buzzed in, and then go to a secure window for somebody to receive them. We use video cameras to identify the person before they come in. Our staff is trained not to let anybody in if they're nervous about it or if they don't recognize the person. And so by separating out the visitor entrance from the staff entrance, it just adds one little extra layer of security. To do that though, if you picture this foyer over here, or the one over in Ovid, it is going to create we have to do a little construction.
It's going to create a bottleneck.
Yeah, we have to design it so that it does that, because it doesn't right now.
What about the whirly doors?
We haven't talked about that. So it'll almost certainly be a buzz-in system similar to this, but it'll be separate from the ones that the staff enters. That's really the big difference. Okay, timeline. It doesn't happen quickly. People do need to understand that this vote is happening on December 13th. If the vote passes, the board will accept that vote at their December 15th board meeting and get the ball rolling on these projects, but it's a long process. And so what we're looking at here, I'm not going to read every single one of these. Part of it is design and development that comes right after the vote. the next part is creating construction documents, and then we gotta get it to state ed. Anything that is subject to state aid, and we're counting on this state aid, but really anything at all that we do capital-wise in a school district has to be, the plans have to be approved at state ed. Sometimes that can be the longest part of the process as we wait for it to get through its review process. So what you can see here is, like, we're looking at trying to get it by the end of the school year this year, and then looking at, trying to get everything finalized into like November of 23. Were you gonna ask something about that?
I apologize for being late earlier, and I know that you were talking about funds and how they're gonna be dispersed and so on and so forth. The thought that came to my mind is, we're talking about this 400,000. Now, if the 400,000 isn't spent completely, does that roll over? Or say we only spend 372,000?
So think of it this way. The analogy doesn't always work at schools to compare it to like a household budget, but in this case, I think it does apply. When you take out a loan for your mortgage and you get the payment schedule, you know your payment schedule way in advance. That's the situation with the 400,000. So it's built into our debt schedule. It's not going to change. So the only thing that could ever change it is every once in a while there's some political conversations at Albany about phasing out capital aid, and that makes everybody nervous because Albany has made some promises here. The promise, if we go farther with this project, is that they will provide that aid like into the 20 or 30 year bond schedule. They've never backed out on that promise. Nobody ever expects them that they will. And so just sometimes every once in a while when it comes up in a political discussion, it gets people a little nervous. But in this particular case, it's one of the few times where we can actually predict the future right to the penny for years and years in advance. So that 400,000 is as rock stable as it gets. You do see, if you look in the chart, I'll go back just real quick, that it's not 400,000 even every year. It goes, 403, 401, 400, 402. But it is baked into the schedule, so we know it well in advance.
And I apologize, is that 400, is that the repayment that the school district is responsible for repaying, or is that 400 that the school district is to spend on projects? So
this 400 is part of our debt service. So the rest of this chart shows that we've got principal payments on these loans, that's this column. We've got interest payments on these loans, that's that column. So this column here adds these first two, so it's principal plus interest equals the payment that we owe. So that's what we got to pay every year. It's like in the neighborhood of $1.5 million. But right behind that is, right behind that is $1.2 million in state aid.
Coming in.
So it comes to us from the state to offset that, and what's left is the 400,000.
And that's for us to...
So that's part of our general fund budget.
Okay.
If you think about our $26 million budget, sometimes the way I talk about it is, if you think about 1% of our budget, that's about $260,000. So 400,000, it's like roughly 1.5% of our budget. And so it's right in our budget, it's stable, we know it's going to be there for a long time, it doesn't change. That's why when we go forward with this and we say there will be no additional tax impact, that's the reason we can say that. Because it's just baked right in all the way through. And I don't know if you missed that part where I was talking about this, but we can anticipate this ahead of time, and then we can arrange our borrowing as such to even out that number right at the 400,000 so that we don't have any uncertainty about it. We make it so. Just quickly back to the timeline. So we got to go through all of that SED approval. Once we get SED approval, we send this out to bid. We're expecting all of this to happen next winter, so the 23-24 winter, which will set us up for a construction season primarily in the summer of 24. So people do need to know that we vote in December of 22, but you won't actually see construction start for about a year and a half while we go through all of this process. It's normal, it's just the way the system works. It's us taking advantage of that borrowing schedule and then scheduling out the contractors in a way that has the least impact on everybody. So as we get into construction, our timeline is that we want it to be finished by that next school year. So you'll see a lot of it primarily finished earlier than that. But we're holding open this timeline all the way into 2025 as we make sure that we phase it out the right way. I do have one last thing to mention before we close tonight. In the newsletter, as part of my letter to the community, we talk about this whole 400,000 thing and the way it comes up in cycles. And so we say, roughly every 5 years or so, we get back to planning the next big capital project. But we live in some interesting times right now, and we're in a particular moment in time where money has come to us from the federal government that's allowing us to do even more capital work. And because this was COVID money, we're allowed to spend this money to do projects on air quality. And so what we've got going on in parallel to all of this is actually some pretty big work that we're going to do in both of these buildings for air quality. So heating, ventilating, air conditioning, both of these buildings. We're taking advantage of federal money and we're taking advantage of state grant money through NYSERDA. And we're trying to plan out that we can do this in parallel to the project that we're talking about. And I don't want people to get confused by that. I don't want them to misunderstand that this work is part of the project that we've been talking about. So in red here, I've said that these projects are completely unrelated to what you're voting on in December. This is happening because federal money has come our way, and we have it earmarked for doing this particular work. Even though it's true that these cycles come up every 5 years, in this particular moment, we're actually juggling a few different ideas about projects that will have a little bit of an impact to the building. But people just need to understand that this is like a one-time only opportunity of the money that's come our way. It needs to be spent by a certain time. And so and there's only certain categories that can be spent for. Air quality is one of them, and so we're going to be addressing HVAC in both buildings over the next, almost a simultaneous timeline, like across the next few years. And so people might be wondering how we can do that and this project at the same time, and that's the reason. So I didn't want to end tonight without mentioning that so that people aren't surprised by it. Those are the slides. So any final questions? Peter?
Jumping back to the projects in Interlaken, there's some sidewalks identified?
Yeah. So we've been talking about both repairing the existing sidewalks and then maybe expanding the sidewalks. So the loop here in front of the building is going to get some work. The sidewalk that exists here kind of stops at that door. And so we want to expand that sidewalk around the perimeter of this corner of the building here. And then we've also talked about creating more sidewalk that goes from the parking area here over to this corner of the building and back around to the playground. So that's been kind of a later conversation, but we're pretty confident that we can do that.
One of my concerns is that that main loop there is deteriorating quickly, and it's going to be roughly 2 years before we start this and get it underway. repair of sidewalks, there's currently a grant out there that could cover that we could actually start that sooner.
So we don't want to delay it if it doesn't have to be delayed.
Yeah.
So we're aware of grants that are out there. We do want to get that work done. So it's always possible that some of this could happen on a faster timeline than what I'm describing here, especially the sidewalk work. That can usually get done a lot faster. And it's a little bit more of an expedited process. We don't have to go through as many hoops in terms of state ed. The only thing is if we're going to fund it with this money that's approved by the voters, if it has to be packaged in that project number. But there are other ways that we can address sidewalks. You're absolutely right. Brenda? Oh, okay.
I was gonna say those stairs up front should be looked at again too. They're,
Right out in front of the main entrance there? Yeah, we've talked about that too.
oh, right, from that
Yeah.
lower parking lot by
Yeah.
the,
Yeah, and sometimes, honestly, I mentioned before, sometimes there are things that we feel like we can do in-house, and so that might be one of those.
well, they've been kind of.
I know.
patched together, but they need a.
I agree. I agree. I've taken pictures of it myself.
With the topic of sidewalks, especially on the back side of the building with where the parking area is it possible to have this studied to maybe change up the traffic flow and the parking? Because I am a parent who bring my son to school in the morning, I pick him up in the afternoon every day. And just sitting in the parking lot and watching how the traffic flow works, some days it's like, how we don't have an accident is mind-boggling. So if we have the capability to upgrade the sidewalks, add sidewalks, change things up a little bit, would this be an appropriate time to think about some of this?
It would be the perfect time to talk about it, because if we're going to tear this parking lot up and put in, put in a new version of it, then it would be the perfect time to talk about traffic flow. So maybe we'll engage people more about that conversation and ideas about what people's experiences are and what might make that better. But that's definitely something that we can put in the design.
Because I mean that's a huge, in my mind, with little kids running around all over, that's a huge, that's probably one of the biggest safety issues that I see with
Yeah.
the current configuration.
Every school deals with this, especially at entry time and dismissal time. And so what you're always going for is some kind of one-way traffic version where people can come in and out. But, people sometimes get impatient and they mess up the traffic pattern. So, but yeah, absolutely. It's something that will go into the design. Brenda?
I'd like to go on with that. I think it's something we've discussed for over 30 years. Signage. I mean, if there's a way to embrace or increase signs that say one way,
Yeah.
slow, no stopping, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Not to mention all the signage we need inside.
yeah.
But yeah. I have one more question.
Okay.
Is the monies are not earmarked? Is the total about $22 million project? It's not earmarked. This for and this for the Owen facility, or if it is, and is it? How much about is being spent at the Owen facility, and how much at the Interlaken?
So we have in the room with us our financial planners from Bernie Donegan's office. We've got representatives here from Hunt, and we have representatives here from our construction manager, CNS. These are exactly the kinds of questions that they work with us for. So CNS is providing a lot of our estimated costs for each piece of this project. Bernie Donegan's office keeps track of all of it because it has to be, what I didn't really get into is that another way that state aid works is that there are ceilings for particular buildings that we have to pay attention to that goes into aidability of the project. So I don't know, do you have an answer to that part of it? I see you shuffling your papers.
Here, I have the survey if you want. So, based on the scope provided by CNS, we do have a breakdown generally by building. So overall, for the high school, it looks like about $2.8 million of work will be invested in that building. and then about $4.1 million at the elementary building, at this building here, of the overall
And then the bus
authorization.
garage price tag is?
So the bus garage overall, including everything, is just under $15 million of the 21.9 million. And then there's some demo costs, just over $100,000 for the tear down of the existing bus garage.
There you go. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I know, sure.
So,
Bus guy just have to put the other thing up.
this is the way my brain works.
Sure.
So currently, right now, in our economic times, we're seeing record high inflation. The cost of everything is steadily upward. By the time we get to construction phase, so on and so forth, is this plan, does it have that built into it?
It does.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons that we employ our construction manager to do the estimates. They do have to take into consideration rising costs over time. So it's impossible really to do an exact estimate,
Right.
but they do factor in the price today is not going to be the price 2 years from now. So they have to think about all the materials that it takes, and et cetera, everything that's going to cost. And they have to build in escalated costs just based on the fact that it's going to be 2 years down the line. So the estimate does include that, yes.
Now, is there a point, and I don't want to be negative here, but if our current economic times keep going the way they're going, is there going to be a point where the school district evaluates and says, okay, we need to put the brakes on here and put this project off until a later time when something, when it cools off a little bit? Is there that threshold built in?
It's a good question, but I guess my answer is coming back to that 400,000. So remember that in terms of the overall budget, this $400,000 number is about 1.5% of the budget. One of the board goals is to maintain excellent facilities, and we get consistent praise about the condition of our facilities. It's something that we really care about. We know that we're a big part of the community, and so we want to maintain excellent facilities that can be used by the whole community. And by doing this system with this plan, and knowing that it's going to cost us that stable 400,000, 1.5% of our budget going into the future, if we get to hard times where reductions have to happen, there's the other 98.5% of the budget to look at. And so once we commit to this kind of a project, we're going to see it through to the end. There wouldn't be a situation where we divert halfway through. Once we get this project rolling, we'll see it through. I guess the only tiny caveat to that is, in December, going to the voters is a number, that $21.9 million number, and that's the authorization that we're allowed to spend. So if it turns out that we get near the end of the project and we find that this project is actually, in order to do this scope of work, it's actually going to cost $25 million. We are not allowed to spend $25 million on the project. So that's right. So either we've got to scale back and take away some things that we had planned, or we've got to come back to the voters and say, we need more.
So, I know that you were talking earlier about the assessment list and prioritizing what needs to get done. Is that list available for public viewing?
The BCS?
Yes.
Yes, public document.
I'll say it's very large, and it's available in paper at Steve's office. Okay.
But there are different versions.
Because I've gone and looked at it, it's pretty thorough,
Yeah. There are different versions of it. There's a more detailed version and a more streamlined version. So, it just depends on how interested somebody is, but,
And I'm not trying to nitpick, I'm
just
trying to get a
I'd be
sense.
happy to, facilitate anybody taking a look at it. It's actually a pretty fascinating document.
Could that be placed in the lobby?
The DCS? Nobody has ever asked for that before. We could. Yeah, easy. Any other questions? You can tell your friends that we've recorded this. Thank you to Brandon for doing that. So it will be, the recording of this whole conversation will be on our YouTube channel where we have the board meetings, so that between now and voting time, people can review the conversation and please encourage people to ask more questions. We want people's questions to be answered and encourage people to come out and vote. We want a big vote turnout. Lower Cafeteria, Ovid, December 13th, 1 to 8 p.m. Thank you, everybody.